Sherry. Welcome to Stories. This week's story is not a short story. It is the first chapter of a book by Julia Frenz. It is about a young woman's journey to Russia shortly after the fall of the USSR. She lived there for 2 years. While there, she practiced Russian, translated texts, traveled, and learned not only a lot about Russia and its people, but about people themselves. Without further ado, here is Chapter 1 of In the Wrinkle of the Old Cliff by Julia Frenz. Утес. Ночевала тучка золотая на груди утеса великана. Утром в путь она умчалась рано, по лазури весело играя. Но остался влажный след в морщине старого утеса. Одиноко он стоит, задумался глубоко, и тихонько плачет он в пустыне. The Cliff by Mikhail Lermontov, 1841. A slip of golden cloud rested overnight in the bosom of the gigantic cliff. Before long, she is happily playing in the azure sky, while a damp trace remains in the wrinkle of the old cliff. Alone he stands in deep reflection and cries silently in the wilderness. Chapter 1. Courtesans. A friend of a friend of a friend of my sister's finally, and I mean finally, came through with a real live contact in Russia. I had been trying for so long. I went over to this lady's house. Her name was Tanya. When I walked in the door, she said, "You're not what I expected." My mother later said, "What did she expect?" "I don't know," I said. My mother said you should have asked her. I know, right? She also tried to dissuade me from going to Russia. She said that her cousin is sick and won't be able to pick me up at the airport, so I'll have to take a train. Ugh. And she said, "Of course, you don't know what you're getting into. Don't trust Russians. If you do, that will be your fatal flaw. And they hang their laundry on the balcony, so be prepared for laundry traffic." My room was going to be the balcony. But getting back to trusting Russians, so far the only Russian I should not have trusted was this lady. She really got her mother a good deal. I am paying the mother a whole year's pension in cash. Granted, she is living in poverty, but they all are. She is not living any worse or better than anyone else over there. But now, thanks to me, she is getting double her annual income in one fell swoop. However, I will say one thing in this woman's favor. She had the most beautiful, the healthiest-looking Clerodendron Thompsonii I had ever seen, draped around her sunny kitchen. In fact, I hate to admit it, I had never seen one in person before, only in books. The flowers have a pure white calyx and crimson red corolla. I desperately wanted a cutting. I complimented her on her gorgeous Clerodendron Thompsonii, even using the proper scientific name, and hoping that she might offer me a cutting. But no, she didn't. I don't even think she knew what its name really was. I still thought that she was a whiz at plants, because this is a tricky liana. As a plant person, she had my respect. So I'm going. I'm actually going. Things were really moving along now. I went to my doctor, who gave me a booster shot for tetanus, polio, and diphtheria. He said to me, "I'm glad you're leaving. Work hard, be diligent, and look for work as an expat who is fluently bilingual." Just for clarification, he said he was glad I was leaving because this was something I really wanted to do, not because he didn't want to see me anymore. You are probably thinking that this contact lived in Moscow, the big cabbage, No, although that would have been exciting. What did Winston Churchill say about Moscow? Despite the perfume, the satin and lace, underneath, Russia will always be an old whore. Oh, he said that about the whole country. Sorry. But wait, as a matter of fact, Winston Churchill never said that. It was Dwight D. Eisenhower who said it to Winston Churchill in December of 1953 at the Western Summit in Bermuda. He said, "Russia is a woman of the streets, and whether her dress is new or just the old one patched, she is certainly the same whore underneath, and the United States intends to drive her off her present beat into the back streets." He was expressing his frustration with Soviet policy and with Churchill. Russia had just acquired the hydrogen bomb in August of 1953. They got the bomb by stealing secrets thanks to Russian spies and American traitors. No wonder Eisenhower was testy. Also, Churchill wanted to open avenues of communication with the Soviets. He wanted to talk, also known as détente. Eisenhower did not. It turns out that Ike was right. The détente that started with President Nixon in 1969 was ended by Reagan in 1980. A note before we take leave of Winston Churchill. Central Europeans, or who people usually call Eastern Europeans, can never forgive Churchill for throwing Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, the Balkans, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and the eastern third of Germany to the wolves. The wolves meaning the Soviets. He is despised for consigning an entire generation of free countries with free people to languish behind the Iron Curtain, his words, and to a life of poverty, ignominy, and police state repression. But speaking of old courtesans from Moscow, there really was one. What am I saying, one? I mean a famous one. They called her La Paiva. She was born Esther Blanche Lockman into a poor Jewish family living in the slums of Moscow in 1819. Her father was a weaver. As a teenager, she married a tailor with tuberculosis and had a son. Then she realized where her true talents lay, no pun intended, and took off to Paris, never to see her son, whose name was Antoine, or family again. Don't let the dust get in your eyes, sonny. He died while attending medical school. What she wanted to be when she grew up was rich. Whatever she had to do, she would do. She became not only the richest courtesan in Paris, she was one of the most successful courtesans in the world. Even though she wasn't beautiful, not even pretty, some called her mannish. With her big eyes and pear-shaped nose, the French have a word for it, belle laide, or beautiful ugly. Similar to Humphrey Bogart. He was so ugly that he was kind of cute. It's too bad we don't have a photo or painting of her. All that we have is one drawing of her profile. She slept with as many men in Paris as she could. There was even a young banker named Adolphe Gaiff, who ran after La Paiva until she finally said, "If you want me, you must take out 20 1,000-franc banknotes and burn them one by one, and that's how long you can have me." La Paiva was sharp, but Gaiff was no dummy either. After betting his buddies that he could accomplish this without paying, he found some counterfeit bills. But Gaiff was apparently still so turned off at the thought of burning money, he couldn't do it. So La Paiva did it for him. She unknowingly burned fake money. What kind of deviant relishes the burning of cold, hard cash, the one thing that she's running after? She became the mistress of the very popular and kind pianist Henri Hertz. He was also Jewish, and there could have been some Semitic camaraderie between them. Who knows? All we know is that after she financially ruined him, his family kicked her out but kept her daughter, their granddaughter, Henrietta. Esther had no use for her son, so why would she care what happens to her daughter? The poor thing unfortunately died at the tender age of 12. After being hurled onto the streets by this family, Esther, also known as Thérèse, her street name, lived destitute and ill in a Paris hotel for 3 years. These years were the worst years of her life. She vowed that if she lived, she would never be so poor again. Shades of Scarlett O'Hara? She did eventually build her palace, only yards from where she had suffered, planning and scheming a way out. She later said that everything happened through willpower. Circumstances did not exist. One created them when one wanted. She dragged herself out of the Parisian gutter by visiting London at the suggestion of her dressmaker, of all people. The dressmaker was clever. She figured if Esther made it, she would also grow rich by making her clothes. Sure enough, on her first night in London, she seduced Lord Stanley at the Opera House in Covent Gardens. She slipped into the box right beside his. I do not know if she plied her trade right there in the Opera House. That would be rather unseemly. However, since she went on to become a big hit in London, I imagine that she secured a suitable pied-à-terre in which to conduct business. Having conquered le crème de la crème of London society, which makes one wonder how really creamy were they, she realized she needed more than wealth. She needed a title. And this brought her to a spa in Baden, Germany, where she met her first titled husband-to-be, Portuguese Marquis Albino Francesco Araújo de Paiva. And fortunately for her, her slum-dwelling husband had died of tuberculosis, so she was free to marry. On June 5th, 1851, she married the Marquis. Henceforth, she would always be known as La Paiva. But Esther, being Esther, was not one to rest on her laurels. What is that motto? Excelsior? Ever upward. What I mean is that having acquired the title, she no longer needed the husband. So a few months after the marriage, she wrote to him, "I wanted a position, and I've got it, but all you have is a prostitute for a wife. You can't take me anywhere, and you can't introduce me to anyone. We must, therefore, separate. You go back to Portugal. I shall stay here with your name and remain a whore." Can't argue with that. Don't marry whores, gentlemen. Don't do it. The now Marchioness could not live on the trifling sums her titled husband had left her, so she went out and snared her final conquest, her biggest catch, Guido Henkel von Donnersmarck, 11 years her junior. When I say she went out, I mean she went all out. She tracked him around Europe for months. She would suddenly materialize wherever he was, decked out in all her dazzling glory, and ignore him completely. She spent 300,000 francs doing this. He finally took note and began to follow her. They married October 28th, 1871, right after her marriage to Paiva was annulled. A few months later, in 1872, Paiva killed himself. He was never able to make back the money his wife had spent. It was his father's genius that had made the fortune, not him. Von Donnersmarck really was a catch. He would one day be made a prince by the Kaiser and died the second wealthiest man in Germany. He owned copper, ore, iron, and silver mines in Silesia. Silesia is now part of Poland. This inexhaustible supply of wealth was poured into the biggest, most opulent private hotel on the Champs-Élysées that took 10 years to build and was finished in 1866. It is still there today. It is called the Travelers Club, and you can visit it, but only if you are a member, and only if you are a man, which is so ironic considering who built it. This hotel was made from onyx, marble, rare woods, and jewels. Lapaiva balked when she saw the estimate for her bed. 50,000 francs! Do you want me to get fleas? Make it 100,000. That's what I said to IKEA. $200? You want me to get bed bugs? Make it $250. Her bed was encrusted with rare woods and ivory and stood under a ceiling where Zorya, Slavic goddess of the dawn, hovered over all. This is the goddess who embodies strength, resilience, and divine beauty. The mural on the ceiling of the reception area of this hotel is Lapaiva as the goddess Zorya chasing away the night. Paul Baudry was the painter. He went on to paint the frescoes in the foyer of the Garnier Paris Opera House. Some critics said that the murals he painted in this building were worth more than anything else she filled her hotel with. Her bathtub was solid onyx, lined with silvered bronze and etched with designs. The 3 faucets were sculpted and encrusted with jewels. One tap was for hot water, the second for cold water, and the third tap was for, well, what do you use your third tap for? Champagne, of course. She sent people to India to look for the rarest, most beautiful wall hangings. The seat beside her bed was solid silver. The stoves in the kitchen were of Dresden china. You get the idea. Putting aside what she actually did to get where she was, there was no smoking, gambling, or singing at her soirees in this gorgeous abode. It was talk and more talk by the liveliest male wits of the day, and if you were a bore, you were not invited back. No women were ever invited to her hotel because no woman of good repute would ever dare cross her threshold. There was only one Parisian actress who deigned to sit at her table. The windows were equipped with iron shutters, and for some reason, she never lit a fire in the house. Winters were very cold, and the heart of a whore is the coldest place of all, as cold as the pavement, and some might have said that there was a sinister air about the place. As Alexander Dumas Fille wrote about the hotel, "It's almost finished. All it needs is a sidewalk." Von Donnersmarck also bought his wife a 16th century chateau. It was because of this that her guests were able to eat grapes, cherries, and peaches in the middle of the winter. But this is not the end of her story. No, the end is really nothing that you could ever imagine. The Franco-Prussian War broke out in 1870, and by 1877, Esther and Guido had to leave France. In fact, they were ordered out because they were suspected of spying for Germany. They were spying for Germany. Donnersmarck was Bismarck's cousin. Von Donnersmarck whisked his wife off to Silesia, where he had a castle. In 1877, she was 58 years old and in decline. People grew old so quickly back then. She suffered a stroke and actually broke the Venetian mirror in her bedroom so that she wouldn't have to look at her paralyzed face. 4 personal maids were unable to hide or mask the effects of the stroke. Milk baths, lime flower baths, and champagne baths could not stop her body swelling from the effects of heart disease. On January 21st, 1884, she died in her Silesian castle at the age of 65. Or did she? Some people cannot bear to part from their loved ones. They might even keep their beloved's ashes stored under their bed for years after the event. And they may even, but I've never heard of this before, do what Guido Henkel von Donnersmarck did. He preserved his beloved Peva in alcohol. Then he shut her up in a locked room in the upper reaches of the castle, where he could visit his lover any time of the day or night. Sound crazy? I'm getting chills just thinking about it. Even with La Peva's old, swollen body pumped full of alcohol to keep it from rotting, von Donnersmarck still got lonely. He eventually married a lovely young Russian woman. One day, as she wandered through the cavernous castle, full of halls and doors and locks, she came upon the one room she was never allowed to enter. And, being a normal, curious person, Katerina, her name was Katerina, managed to unlock the lock and enter the room. I wish I could have seen her face when she saw La Paiva in the middle of the room dancing. Of course, she wasn't dancing. The sack of bones, organs, and skin soaked in alcohol was posed as if it were. Jane Eyre by the incomparable Charlotte Bronte comes to mind when Mr. Rochester takes Jane upstairs to the locked room, only to uncover his awful secret. There lay his mad wife in all her terrifying degradation, the wife he was still legally married to. Yes, Charlotte Bronte may have heard of this and incorporated it into her novel. But enough about world-famous Russian courtesans. She may be the first hoe in this story, but she ain't the last. I was going to St. Petersburg, you say? Russia's second biggest city, built by Italian masters, also called the Venice of the North because of its many canals. No, it wasn't St. Petersburg. It just so happened that my contact was an old lady, her daughter, and 4 kids, in an apartment in Sochi on the shores of the Black Sea. Not bad. Not bad at all, I thought. I would have to stay on the balcony, but that was okay. I mean, the balcony was not exposed to the elements. It was an enclosed affair with windows. And besides, this was Sochi, the subtropics. Beach culture, right? Am I right? Do the sunny, sandy beaches of Florida spring to mind? Hold that thought. Russia is a huge country. Even after the Soviet Union broke up, it's still the biggest one in the world. There are so many places where I could have ended up, but Sochi on the Black Sea won out. The Black Sea, where the Argonauts went in search of the Golden Fleece. Quote, where a young man goes on an adventure, he fights strange and terrible enemies, makes allies and adversaries, and returns with the prize. During his journey, he learns both humility and compassion. He also learns to respect and fear the gods. That's pretty much what happened to me, too. When I got there, it was a quiet, depressed, dilapidated, run-down resort town, full of mafia, police, refugees, drunken Finns, and everyday working people. To be sure, strange and terrible enemies with the possibility of making a friend here and there. As for the gods, the harder they laughed at me, the more I did fear and respect them. But why would I bother going to Russia at all? That is a good question, and the answer is simple. I had a degree in Russian, and I wanted to practice my Russian language skills. This I explained to the nice gentleman at the Russian consulate where I went to apply for my visa. The year was 1993, 2 years after the conclusion, shall we say, of the Soviet Union. May it rest in pieces. I needed a visa and an invitation from a Russian citizen or Russian organization. We all sat down together in a kind of small room, actually. When I say we all, I mean me and 3 male embassy staff. They seemed quite curious why I would want to go to Russia all by myself. Was I fearless or naive? Maybe mentally ill? Maybe all 3. I guess I wouldn't know until I got there. All I knew was that it was a dream that I had. I mean, a goal. Besides, what's the big deal? People travel alone. Women do travel alone. They took out cigarettes, offered me one, and we smoked and talked for about half an hour. They were friendly and actually appeared solicitous of my welfare. They knew what I was. They knew exactly what I was. That's their job, people. I came away with a good feeling about the whole thing. I think I had passed my test for a visa. Now all I needed was the invitation from the old lady